Fiona, thank you very much for this. If you have questions, I'll take questions from anybody in the audience as well. But I think what Fiona was saying is really important that we have to remember that folklore and collection and so on is an ongoing event. Certainly for a while, I think there was a feeling that, certainly in Gaelic circles, that people were collecting to preserve what was just about going to be lost. But it's very important, I think, to carry on recording, because there are many things that have survived the change in lifestyle and people's different work styles and so on. Coming to that, in terms of you're working for the National Trust for Scotland at Canna, can you tell us a little bit about what's going on in Canna at the moment, in terms of the people who live there, in terms of their farming and culture and so on, but also what the National Trust are doing and yourselves?
Well, Canna is a small island, about 4.5 miles long by 1 mile wide, and we have a population of 16. So it's a very small population, but it's a thriving Hebridean community. The National Trust for Scotland owns the island and owns the collection, but we have it's almost like a community council as well, who look after the matters within the community of the people. So the community raise money for projects, like we have just opened a wind turbine array and solar array, so we're now completely self-sufficient for power and energy, which for a community of 16 is quite an achievement. That's been the biggest project which has happened over the last few years, so the National Trust for Scotland support that, but the community deliver the project. So there's a very close partnership between the Trust and the Community Trust, which is great. We have a thriving campsite, we have a thriving B&B and a cafe, and that is it basically. That's what we have. We have no Tesco's, we have no coffee shops, we have nothing like that at all. So it's probably one of the most traditional Hebridean crofting communities that is left, in that there's no traffic on the island. The only cars on the island are owned by ourselves. Visitors can't take cars onto the island because the road wouldn't cope with it. So the whole island kind of revolves around the farm. It's a very successful working farm. John Lorne Campbell bought Canna in 1938 with the aim of establishing or re-establishing and continuing a traditional Hebridean crofting community. And by a croft, I mean a small farm, if you like, a small individual farm. So Canna is a collection of crofts, and that was what he wanted to do, with Gaelic at the heart of it, with the church and the school, and really the community still revolves around that. We do have a school, but we don't have any children, so the school's not open at the moment. So it's my job to look after Canna House, which is the house that you saw on the screen, where all the collections are kept. And so it's quite a unique situation, really, to have this tiny little island with a grand house, which is gradually being repaired and restored, which will enable it to be open as a visitor centre and a fully functional research facility too, so that people like Gilbert can come and do research there. But in the meantime, I'm very conscious of trying to continue that folkloring tradition in the community, and speaking to Hebridean, gathering stories and memories from more recent times, as Gilbert was saying. It's really important to do that. We have lots of music. I missed a ceilidh last night. Yesterday we actually had a 10k run on the island, which is not bad for an island that's 4 miles long. So I missed the ceilidh, but I had a great time here last night too. So that's Canna, really.
Does anyone have any questions or points or anything that you thought was a link between the cultures you've been looking at, or even just folklore collecting and, I suppose, the way people's lives are documented and recorded, and I suppose what we as Gaels and Hebrideans can learn from your experiences, but also any questions of whether you could learn from our experience or even just find out what our experience is. Does anyone have any questions that you talk or anything connected?
It was nice to see the sheep's fleece rather than Halloween, rather than all the plastic synthetic.
Yes, so the Halloween, I suppose,
and the fun that was in it.
yeah, I think that was what I was struck by myself. I suppose the freedom that people felt not to have someone, I suppose, as we're in modern world, we're documenting everything for a 10-minute or 10-second, what's it called? The Snapchat, yes. Sorry, I'm not very Snapchat and Instagram and everything. So we're recording everything, but it's very we're not going into depth in that sense of. But they were very much immersed in that situation themselves, enjoying it, doing it with no pressure at all, no worries about the person who was looking at the camera, how they were going to look on the camera and so on. Although there was an interesting moment when she was doing the milking song, and the woman, Mariandra, I think, was singing the song, and her last line was, "How was that? Get that thing out of my sight." Machas mea. So I think we have to remember as well that although they gave their time freely and they gave their songs freely, sometimes I suppose they felt that, as Margaret said herself, that she was following them around with a tape recorder. It was sometimes a little bit of an imposition, and but it was very much, I think, of a why is she interested in our insignificant lives? That was very much the thought that people had. But I think the beauty of the people like Margaret and people who came in from the outside is that they saw and they recognised the beauty and they gave it worth. And I think that is such an important thing to give communities confidence, because even for myself, like, I kind of dismiss what I'm doing because I've grown up with Gaelic, and I've grown up with Gaelic song, and I've grown up singing that thing, and I just think it's just what I do. And then it's that kind of affirmation from the outside which I think makes you step back and think, actually, what I have and what we have as an indigenous culture is very much worth preserving, and it's very much very much worth taking forward to the next generation as well. Because I think that is one of the main things that we have to work on, certainly with the Gaelic culture, is how we're taking that forward to the next culture. Because as the last 20 years, as I'm sure with all cultures, there's been a huge shift in terms of just even technology, improvement in technology, making things move very quickly. So we have to kind of remember how we're going to make Gaelic still relevant to the 21st century, but also how do we get people to use Gaelic in normal settings, because once you get to a certain tipping point where a certain part of the population, through people moving out of the Hebrides for work and people moving in for work and so on, so it's no longer a Gaelic-speaking community or a monoglot Gaelic-speaking community, as was the case with Margaret Fay Shaw. She had to learn Gaelic because there was nothing else, because everything happened in Gaelic. Now, if you go to South Uist, up to 75 or 80% of the population speak Gaelic, but if you're then in a situation where not everyone understands, you tend to speak the language that everyone will understand, meaning that the Gaelic language and the minority language will sometimes suffer in that context. In terms of the archive, and I'll give you a few more minutes to think of a question if anyone has any more questions, but in terms of the Gaelic language in the archive, can you tell us a little bit about what records you have, and in terms of the breadth across from Scotland, but also Cape Breton and so on?
Yes, John Lorne Campbell, Margaret's husband, he was a great Gaelic scholar, and he also learnt the language. He also had American roots as well as Scottish roots, but he was the first person to go to Nova Scotia. He went to Nova Scotia in 1932, and he undertook the first, in fact I think it may still be the only survey of the Gaelic language in Nova Scotia. And he went from community to community recording who spoke Gaelic, whether it was their only language, whether they spoke it at home or in the church or in school, or just generally a complete overview of where Gaelic was at the heart of Nova Scotia. And that really formed the beginning of a very long relationship that he had with Gaelic in Nova Scotia. And he published a very, very significant collection of songs called Songs Remembered in Exile, where he recorded all the remaining native Gaelic speakers in Nova Scotia and their songs, which is still one of the principal seminal works on Gaelic song in Nova Scotia. So he did massive amounts of research, which we have in Canna House, all the original notebooks, all the original manuscripts in Canna House, but not just of Canada, but also obviously from the Hebrides. He spent 5 years living in Barra, where he collected songs and stories from all the tradition bearers around about that time. That's from sort of 1929 to 34 to 35 when he got married to Margaret. And we have all these original transcriptions, these notes, these notebooks, which are just incredibly valuable in his own handwriting. Huge amounts of research potential to be done there. He also was interested in folklore worldwide. He constructed one of the most important folklore libraries, certainly in Scotland, if not in the world, where we have collections of folk song from Jamaica and all sorts of exciting places. And it's all in one place. He also had a big interest in Irish and in Welsh, and he taught himself to speak Gaelic, Irish, Gaelic as well. So he was a very, very broad-minded, very diverse academic mind. So the important thing really is the partnership he was able to have with Margaret, because with her musical skills and her photography skills, they were able to build up this incredible jigsaw of archive, where you have the recording of Annie Johnston in Barra. She was one of the great tradition bearers in the 30s. You have her voice on the tape. I actually also have a recording of her heartbeat, which is something really special. We have her recording, then we have photos that Margaret took of Annie, and then we have her letters to John and to Margaret all throughout their lives. Then we have her handwriting and her little notes in the visitors' book in Canna House. And we have her handkerchief. All these kind of things. It just makes up a complete, it's like a Venn diagram really. Everything feeds into everything else. You can't isolate one part of the archive from the other, because it is like a jigsaw. If you take one part of that jigsaw away, then the other jigsaw fragment, the rest of the jigsaw fragments and loses its worth. Each part is hugely valuable in itself, but the sum of the whole is that much more valuable. And I think that's what makes Canna House so unique and so valuable.
I would like to ask also about the Pintxos. I'm from Spain. It has been funny when I saw the Pintxos at the beginning because of Magda. The heritage of the Basque country with Magda, also Spain is also at the house. There are a lot of things from her.
Oh yes, yes.
So you have it like a Spanish food.
Oh yes, yeah.
The 16 people.
Yeah. Magda is still very much involved in the whole Canna House. I was speaking to her on WhatsApp this morning. She's in Hondarribia at the minute. She's coming back this summer. Yeah, she is she's ingrained within Canna House. There are parts of the catalogue which Magda worked on with Margaret are written in Basque. Some are written in Spanish. You know, I find post-it notes on boxes of papers to be archived in Spanish. I'm like, thanks, Magda. That's great. No. So, but her presence is there throughout the whole of the house, and again, she is part of that jigsaw. She cannot be isolated, and her contribution to the formation and the promotion of the Gaelic archives in Canna House cannot be underestimated. She is Canna House, and to have given up her life in a completely strange culture is an amazing thing to do, and she's still, I'd say, she's still part of it, and that's why she is at the beginning of this film, which I've produced, Solace, and she appears throughout the rest of the film to her voice. and I put her under image as well. So she's very, very much part of it. And when she comes back, we have Pintxos every night and a glass of cava or something lovely, yes. So she brings a whole new dimension to Canna.
Oh, yes, you're something.
Can I ask a quick question? Great ignorance. I know nothing at all about Gaelic culture and language. You asked whether there are resonances between that and the other stuff that we were doing yesterday. One of the elements, very strongly as far as I'm concerned, in the South American community that I'm dealing with, is the importance of the language in containing ways of thinking which cannot be mapped onto the language I speak. Does that have any resonance with the language you've grown up with?
Yes, I think there are certain ways that we would say there's when you say how would I translate that into English, and you don't find a ready way of translating that particular phrase into English. And there's I suppose there's also very much there's a thought process, an idea connected with the language. It's very much it has tended to be very much a rural language, agrarian language, so there's lots of words for language and agrarian things. But I suppose the big thing that's happening, and just half a mile down the road, there's the Glasgow Gaelic School with almost 2,000 pupils, and things are changing very rapidly in terms of the language, where it's now very much, there's a rural, older population who speak the language, and they would have been native speakers. And then there are many people, thousands here in Glasgow, Edinburgh and Inverness, who have learned Gaelic as part of their education, and they've got a very different, I suppose, Gaelic means something very different to them, and I suppose the challenge for us as Gaelic speakers and Gaelic educators is bringing those two very different communities together to bring, I suppose, the two different elements of the Gaelic language together. One would be, said, rural native speakers who tend to be older population as well, and the new urban speakers who are speaking the same language, but also it's a very different thought process and different. It's the same language, but it's also it's a very different language as well. So it's how we manage to bring those two things together to take Gaelic forward. I think that's the thing. But there is definitely an idea of traditional Gaelic being an agrarian rural language as well. Jamie?
Yeah, I have 3 children, and my two boys, they both went through Gaelic medium education. So Gaelic was their first educated language. My eldest son is now teaching Gaelic at Bishop Briggs High School, just outside Glasgow. But my youngest son has just completed 2 years working for a project which is Scottish Government funded project called Spores Gaelic, which is designed to train Gaelic speaking outdoor leaders. So he's now a fully qualified outdoor leader, but he's going out into the community, out into the environment, and taking groups of young people mainly out into the environment and using Gaelic as the normal mode of communication. It's all linked to the landscape, to the mountains, but also to fun and to sport, and it's normalising Gaelic, as Gilbert was saying. It's using it, it's not learning it in a classroom situation, but it's using it in normal everyday life, and I think that's hugely important.
And taking on from there, I think that links back to the Canna House archive, and I think this is so important for archives across the world. I'm always struck by a story from Ireland, I think in the 1950s, where they realised that the Gaelic stories and the ideas connected to them about fairies, about second sight and so on, were going, well, people didn't know them, so they went round and wrote down all the stories from all over Ireland that they could find, and then they found out that they had 10,000 boxes with stories on them. And of course they didn't have a plan of what to do with those stories. And I think it's so important for all archives that there's always a plan about how you're going to disseminate the information. There's no I wouldn't say there's no use, but there's little worth in having things stored in a box unless we're going to use them to bring them back to life. And I think that's what's great about the Canna archive, that Fiona's going around the country telling people about what's in the archive, encouraging people to go there, learn from the archive and bring that back into your everyday life. I've been involved in a couple of projects myself where I've been very lucky to go to the School of Scottish Studies archive, for example, learn songs that were sung in South Uist, the place where I come from. I learned them myself, and then I had the opportunity to go back and teach those songs to the people in Uist. So I think it's very important that there's always that idea of a circle. So the collections are going on, then people should be going into the collections, learning from the archives, and then going back and that teaching back to the community. So there's always that circle of culture, so that you have to, in many ways, support and feed back into the indigenous culture. And I think that is a universal theme, I think, for all cultures, that they have to be supported by those who are able to go into the archives and who want to go into the archives, and then bring that culture back and strengthen that culture again.
Yeah, just to say, I wholeheartedly agree with all of that. That forms a large part of my work, is creating the new from the old. And something you said there just created a bit of resonance with me. About 5 years ago, I was doing a project with the National Theatre of Scotland, and I created a piece of music theatre based around Margaret's life, and we opened it in South Uist. And it was the scariest night of my life. I wasn't sure how the audience would react to it. But at the end of the performance, this Cailleach, or old lady, came up to me and she said, "Nishtje, right, lassie, I've just got one thing to say to you." And I thought, oh, no, what did I do wrong? And she said, "I just wanted to thank you for bringing the songs back to us and reminding that we had them in the first place." And to me, that was just, I couldn't have done any more. That was just so important. So I've been building on that and using the old to create the new in my spare time, which is not very much, but just creating new artistic works round about the archive, and it's just a constant source of pleasure and delight to me to be able to do this. So I thoroughly encourage you to do it.
Yeah, thank you.
I just want to say thank you both for being here. It's wonderful. And on that note, I want to open this space as well for you, Fiona. We know you are with the National Trust of Scotland. It's great. Your work has been wonderful, and their support, I'm sure, is really important in the preservation of all this. But you have an audience here of young students and many art historians, a lot of young musicians. What words would either of you would like to tell them? Whether you can offer channels for them to of support, whether they can help in any way. We have wonderful people in tech and technology, and what kind of help do you need in order to preserve the culture and folklore?
Oh gosh, where do I start? We have a big project of a programme of digitisation, because it's difficult for people to come to Canna to do research in the archives. It's not always possible for people to do that. We do continually digitise the paper archives as the money becomes available. We're also, so if anybody wants to have digital copies of any papers or things that you might want, or songs or whatever, then you just email me. Or tweet me, or do whatever, and I'll do whatever I can to help with that. We also, in the NTS, you can volunteer. You can become an official volunteer with the NTS, and you could come and you could spend a week with me. You might be cleaning the toilets, but you might also be doing more interesting stuff within the archives. But you certainly get to know the archives. We, as I say, the house is being renovated at the minute, so it's difficult for us to be able to accommodate researchers and people within the house. But we'll always try and do that if we can possibly do that. So that's always something else to keep in mind. It also, you can contact any of the HQ staff at NTS in Edinburgh, and say that you've enjoyed, well, hopefully you've enjoyed what I've had to give you this morning, and you'd like to find out more. Just express an interest, and I think it's always good to remind those at the HQ level of where Canna is, because we're geographically remote. Sometimes we tend to fall off the radar a little bit, so it doesn't do any harm, or just to remind people, or tweet, that's a really good thing actually, because the NTS press department, they do take account of tweets and Facebook posts. So please tweet at Canna NTS and NTS collections, and ask questions, and just show a level of interest. That would be fantastic.
Yes, I work here at the University of Glasgow. I work in Celtic and Gaelic, and please get in touch with me for anything that you would want to just even say, or even any questions that you may have in terms of Gaelic language and so on. I think also, I know I'm preaching to the converted, but and I'm sure there's a lot of negativity about other minority languages throughout the world, as we know there are, but there is an incredible amount of negativity in mainstream media about Scottish Gaelic as well, and they keep saying we get lots of money and so on. So why are you bothering preserving that useless language and so on? So I think it's just a case we have to, as a population in general, stand up against that idea that minorities aren't worth supporting and preserving, and I think it's just getting that narrative out into the mainstream media and across the world about so many indigenous cultures throughout the world, that they are just as important as you might call the mainstream culture and so on, and that they add so much to the fabric of life throughout the world, and every day that a language is lost, we're losing a huge part of humanity. And I think that is the most important message, I would say, not only in terms of Gaelic, but in terms of all folklore, indigenous culture, and so on.